around 300 BCE, a merchant ship went down somewhere in the waters between Cyprus and the Greek mainland, and with it went a cargo of purple dye worth enough to change a man's circumstances entirely. The merchant's name was Zeno, and he was from Citium, a Phoenician settlement on the southeastern coast of Cyprus, and the purple dye he had been carrying was the kind of cargo that serious traders carried, dense with value, easy to transport, slow to spoil. When the ship went down, the dye went with it. Zeno survived. What happened next is one of those small accidents of loss that the ancient sources record with the quiet casualness of people who do not yet know they are describing the origin of something large. Zeno made his way to Athens. He was, depending on which account one follows, either ruined by the loss of the ship or merely redirected by it, and the two versions are not as different as they might seem. Ruin and redirection, when they arrive together, are sometimes the same event seen from different distances. Athens in the early 3rd century BCE was still, in its way, the philosophical capital of the known world. Plato's Academy had been operating for nearly a century. The Lyceum that Aristotle had founded was active. The city was full of schools and arguments and public thinkers who made their living from the careful cultivation of ideas. A man arriving from Cyprus with nothing but himself and whatever remained of his commercial good sense would have found, in Athens, the particular kind of abundance that has no price. The story that reaches across the centuries, smoothed by repetition into something almost too clean, is that Zeno walked into a bookshop shortly after his arrival and found a copy of Xenophon's Memorabilia, the collection of conversations with Socrates. He read it, or began to read it, and asked the bookseller where he might find a man like the one described in the pages. A cynic philosopher named Crates of Thebes happened to be passing. The bookseller pointed. Zeno followed. Whether or not the moment happened in quite that way, the philosophical consequence of it was real. Crates of Thebes was a student of Diogenes of Sinope, which is to say he stood in the most radical lineage that Greek philosophy had yet produced. A tradition of deliberate poverty, public shamelessness, and the absolute rejection of everything that social life regarded as valuable. The Cynics were, in their way, among the most serious philosophers in Athens. They meant what they said. Crates had given away his fortune, and his wife Hipparchia had walked away from wealth and social standing to live beside him in voluntary poverty. And what they were demonstrating, through the form of their lives, rather than through argument, was a conviction that virtue required the total evacuation of external attachment. Nothing outside the self could harm the self. Nothing the world offered was worth accepting if accepting it came at any cost to one's moral character. The Cynics did not merely hold this view, they performed it publicly and without apology in the streets of Athens. Zeno studied under Crates for several years. He took from him the core of what would become Stoic ethics, the conviction that virtue alone constitutes the genuinely good life. That external circumstances are, in the most important sense, beside the point, that the rational soul is both the only thing of real value and the only thing a person can genuinely claim as their own. These were not modest ideas. They cut against nearly everything that the society around them regarded as self-evidently desirable. Wealth, reputation, political power, the love of one's fellow citizens. Zeno absorbed them, turned them carefully, and then began, gradually, to do something with them that Crates had not done and would not have wanted to do. He found the rational structure beneath them, what the Cynics had discovered through a kind of philosophical intuition that only virtue matters, that the rest is noise. Zeno wanted to understand. not merely to embody, not merely to perform, but to derive, to trace the arguments that led from premises to conclusions, to build a framework of logic and physics and ethics that would show from the ground up why the Cynic insight was correct. He was not content with the right answer. He wanted the right answer to have the right reasons. This need for systematic justification took him eventually beyond Crates and into the schools of philosophers he studied after, among them the Academy and the Megarians, whose logicians had been developing tools for argument that Zeno would eventually put to use in ways no Megarian had anticipated. In time, Zeno began to teach. The place he chose was the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, a long colonnade on the north side of the Athenian agora that had been built a century and a half earlier to commemorate Athenian military victories. Its walls bore murals of battles: Marathon, the Trojan War, the Athenian defeat of the Spartans at Ono. These were public paintings, the kind that existed to remind citizens of what their city had accomplished and what it could survive. The agora itself was the civic and commercial heart of Athens, the open marketplace where merchants sold grain and pottery and fish, where courts heard cases, where democratic assemblies organized themselves, where the life of a Greek city made its daily shape. The Stoa Poikile was not a private garden or a wealthy patron's villa or a building set apart from ordinary life. It was a covered walkway that anyone could enter, that anyone could pass through on the way from one part of the city to another, that smelled of stone and foot traffic and the particular outdoor quality of a city that does not keep its thinking indoors. That Zeno chose this place rather than a private school was not an accident. It reflected something he had inherited from the Cynics and from his reading of Socrates, the conviction that philosophy is not a possession of the educated few, but a practice available to anyone with the capacity to reason, which is to say, anyone at all. The Stoa Poikile was open, and there were no walls between Zeno and the city he was speaking to. The painted battles on the walls behind him depicted victories won by force. The arguments he was making in front of them concerned a different kind of victory, available without weapons and without armies, by any citizen standing still enough to listen. The school took its name from the place. The philosophers who gathered and taught there were from then on called Stoics, the people of the porch. What they were teaching in those early years was harder and more systematic than anything Crates had offered. Zeno was drawing together a philosophy that operated on three levels simultaneously: logic, which concerned the analysis of argument and language; physics, which concerned the nature of reality and the rational principle running through it; and ethics, which concerned how a human being ought to live in the light of what logic and physics revealed. These three areas were not separate disciplines in the Stoic understanding. They formed a single integrated whole, and the Stoics were fond of explaining their relationship through the image of an orchard. Logic was the wall that enclosed and protected it. Physics was the trees and the soil. Ethics was the fruit, the thing the whole arrangement ultimately existed to produce. A person who only studied ethics without the logical and physical foundations was, in the Stoic view, working with fruit that had been cut away from its roots. The taste might be good, but the nourishment would not last. Zeno taught on the porch for decades, and the school that grew around him drew students from across the Greek world. When he died around 262 BCE, the continuity of the tradition passed to his student Cleanthes of Assos, and with that passage came the first of the school's several narrow moments of survival. Cleanthes is one of the less celebrated figures in the Stoic lineage, and the relative dimness of his modern reputation does no justice to what he actually was. He had come to Athens as a young man, arriving, according to the ancient sources, with almost no money. Some accounts say he had 4 drachmas. To keep himself alive while he studied philosophy, he worked through the nights as a water carrier and gardener, drawing water for the gardens of wealthy Athenians before the sun rose, sleeping in the afternoons, and spending the remaining hours of his day at the feet of Zeno, listening and arguing and building whatever it was he was building inside himself. When other students and citizens, amused or skeptical, asked how a man who carried water for a living could afford to spend his days doing philosophy, Clintus is said to have answered, without evident embarrassment, that the same body that carried water was also capable of carrying philosophical argument, and that the 2 occupations were not in competition. There is something in this answer that is already, quietly, Stoic, the refusal to be diminished by the external judgment of one's occupation, the calm location of value in the activity itself, rather than in what others make of it. Cleanthes had absorbed not only Zeno's arguments, but the shape of his attitude, the particular bearing of a man who has decided that what the world thinks of his circumstances is simply not one of the things that requires his attention. He held the school together for 32 years after Zeno's death, during which period he wrote prolifically. Ancient catalogues attribute around 50 works to him, almost none of which survive intact. What does survive is his hymn to Zeus, and it is worth pausing on this text in some detail because it reveals something about the Stoic vision that the dry language of doctrine alone cannot quite convey. The hymn is addressed to Zeus, but the Zeus of Cleanthes is not the anthropomorphic ruler of Olympus, who meddles in human affairs and can be appeased with sacrifices. He is a philosophical principle wearing the costume of the old mythology, the rational fire that runs through all existing things, the intelligence immanent in matter, the ordering principle that holds the cosmos together from within rather than governing it from above. Cleanthes writes of this Zeus as the source of all law and all reason, as the entity from whom the rational soul of every human being descends, as the principle in relation to which everything that exists is organized and from which nothing that exists is finally separate. The poem is not a prayer in any ordinary sense. It does not ask for anything. There is no petition, no list of desired outcomes, no appeal for protection or favor. What it offers instead is something closer to alignment, the philosophical soul, recognizing in the act of writing and speaking the rational order that surrounds it and includes it and has always already been working through it. The universe in Cleanthes' vision is not indifferent to human beings. It is not a cold mechanism running without purpose or direction. It is a rationally ordered whole, moving according to principles that human reason can, at least partially, perceive and understand. And the right response to this recognition is not awe in the paralyzing sense, but a kind of settled, grateful orientation, the orientation of a being that has found its place and knows it. This was the intellectual inheritance that passed from Cleanthes to the next generation of the Stoa, and the next generation's task was enormous, because what Zeno had built and Cleanthes had sustained was, by any honest assessment, still a philosophical project under construction. The arguments were there. The 3-part architecture of logic, physics, and ethics was there. The core ethical claims were there. But the detailed elaboration, the systematic filling in, the hundreds of specific philosophical questions that any serious tradition must eventually answer if it is to be used as a genuine guide to thought and life, had not yet been done. That task fell, in large part, to Chrysippus of Soli. Chrysippus came to Athens from Soli in Cilicia, a city on the southern coast of what is now Turkey, and he studied first under Cleanthes, and then, apparently, for a period under the Platonists of the Academy. He eventually returned to the Stoa and spent the remainder of his long philosophical life building what Zeno had begun. The scale of the work was, by ancient reckoning, extraordinary. Ancient catalogues credit Chrysippus with over 700 works, covering every area of Stoic philosophy, logic, rhetoric, epistemology, physics, psychology, ethics, and the analysis of the passions. He was, by all accounts, an exceptionally difficult writer, dense, technical, repetitive, in the way that writers who care more about argument than about prose often are. Readers complained even in antiquity that his works were nearly impenetrable without a guide. This did not seem to trouble him. He was not writing to be enjoyed. He was writing to be correct. The ancient verdict on Chrysippus was unambiguous. A saying circulated in the philosophical schools of Greece that was repeated widely enough to survive across the centuries. If there had been no Chrysippus, there would have been no Stoa. The sentiment captures something real. Zeno had given the tradition its founding ethical vision and its three-part structure. Cleanthes had kept it alive through loyalty and personal philosophical practice. But it was Chrysippus who built the arguments in enough detail, with enough rigor, against enough objections, that the Stoic system could withstand the sustained criticism that any serious philosophical school must face if it is to endure. He made the tradition defensible, not just in its broad outlines, but in its particulars, argument by argument, across every domain it claimed to cover. His work on logic alone was sufficient to place him among the most significant logicians of the ancient world. While Aristotle had developed the logic of categorical syllogisms, arguments of the form all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, Chrysippus developed a logic of propositions and connectives, a system for analyzing arguments whose validity rests on the logical relations between whole statements rather than on the categorical properties of their terms. Modern historians of logic have traced the ancestry of what is now called propositional or sentential logic, one of the foundational tools of contemporary logic and computer science, back through various intermediaries to Chrysippus and his Stoic colleagues. He was not trying to build a tool for later centuries. He was trying to understand, with as much precision as language allowed, the structure of valid reasoning, because for a Stoic, the structure of valid reasoning was not merely a technical matter, but a philosophical one. It bore directly on the nature of the rational soul and its capacity to perceive the rational order of the cosmos. On ethics, Chrysippus elaborated and defended the foundational Stoic claims with a thoroughness that gave the tradition both its strength and its characteristic difficulty. The claim that virtue is the only genuine good, that health and wealth and pleasure are genuinely indifferent, neither good nor bad in themselves, seems on first encounter almost impossible to hold consistently. Surely health is better than illness. Surely the death of someone one loves is worse than their continued life. Chrysippus was not unaware of these difficulties, and he spent considerable philosophical energy on the question of how a rational person could genuinely hold the Stoic ethical position without either suppressing every natural human response or performing a philosophical detachment that the person's actual behavior constantly contradicted. The concept he developed to address this tension, the notion of things that are preferred or dispreferred while remaining ultimately indifferent, became one of the most debated and most useful contributions in the whole history of Stoic thought. A Stoic could prefer health over illness, could take reasonable actions to maintain it, could feel the natural inclination toward life and away from death. What the Stoic could not do was allow the preference to become the kind of evaluation that placed the preferred thing among the genuine goods, among the things for which one might reasonably compromise one's virtue or one's rational self-governance. The line is subtle, and Chrysippus knew it was subtle, and the subtlety did not lead him to abandon the distinction, but to articulate it more carefully. He also did the deep work of Stoic psychology, the attempt to understand what happens internally when a person is overcome by anger or fear or grief, and what the philosophical remedy for such states actually consists in. The Stoic analysis of emotional disturbance began with the observation that these states are not, in the most important sense, caused directly by external events. When someone is hurt by an insult, the insult itself is not sufficient to produce the pain. The pain requires the additional element of a judgment that the insult has damaged something genuinely valuable. When someone is terrified of losing their reputation, the fear is not a simple response to a brute fact, but an evaluation. The evaluation that reputation is the kind of thing whose loss constitutes a genuine harm to something genuinely good. Chrysippus pushed this analysis further than Zeno had, arguing that the passions are not irrational forces that overwhelm reason from outside, but are themselves rational in form. They are judgments, assessments, evaluations of the world. They are simply incorrect ones. This matters enormously, because if the passions are incorrect judgments, rather than forces external to reason, then the remedy is not suppression, but correction, not the violent silencing of feeling, but the slow, patient work of understanding why the underlying evaluation is mistaken, and finding, through that understanding, a different way of holding what one is afraid of losing. Chrysippus built this framework across hundreds of texts, argument by argument, and when he was finished, the Stoa had what it needed to survive as a serious philosophical tradition. It had logic powerful enough to compete with anything the Academy or the Peripatetics could offer. It had a physics, a theory of matter, soul, and cosmological order that was coherent and defensible. And it had an ethics that was specific enough to argue with, systematic enough to teach, and demanding enough to take seriously. After Chrysippus, the Stoic school entered what later historians would call its middle period, and the shape of the tradition began, slowly and in ways that were perhaps not visible to the people living through them, to change. The man most responsible for the first major shift was Panetius of Rhodes, a philosopher who lived in the 2nd century BCE and who spent an important part of his career in the company of Scipio Aemilianus, the Roman general and statesman, in a circle of educated Romans who were genuinely curious about Greek philosophy and what it might offer their own traditions of civic life and practical ethics. Panetius was not a revolutionary, and he did not set out to dismantle what Chrysippus had built. He was a Stoic philosopher of genuine seriousness, trained in the Greek tradition, committed to the core Stoic ethical claims. What he did was translate, not merely from Greek into Latin, but from one intellectual culture into another, from a tradition of rigorous, systematic philosophy developed in Athenian schools into a tradition of practical wisdom developed in Roman political and military life. The Romans who gathered around Scipio were not, for the most part, professional philosophers interested in the technical details of Stoic logic or the fine points of the distinction between genuine goods and preferred indifference. They were magistrates and generals and administrators who wanted to know how a well-ordered mind conducts itself in the practical world, how virtue expresses itself not in the abstract, but in the exercise of duty, in the governance of a city, in the management of one's affairs and relationships and responsibilities to those one serves. Panetius gave them a stoicism that could speak to these concerns. He moderated some of the tradition's more demanding positions, the near impossibility of the ideal sage, the absolute status of the claim that all non-virtuous conditions are completely equal in their indifference, and in doing so made the tradition accessible to people who were not going to spend their lives in philosophical schools. Whether this moderation was a philosophical improvement or a philosophical compromise was a question that later Stoics debated, and the debate was not resolved. What it produced, whatever one thinks of the trade-offs, was a version of Stoicism that could take root in Roman soil, and that would eventually produce, in the generations after Panaetius, some of the most widely read philosophical writing the ancient world would generate. Rome was, in many ways, a more hospitable environment for the kind of Stoicism Panaetius was developing than Athens had been for the kind Chrysippus was developing. Roman culture valued practical wisdom over theoretical sophistication, action over contemplation, duty over speculation. The Stoic emphasis on rational self-governance, on the equanimity with which a person meets difficulty, on the indifference of external fortune to the genuinely good life, these were ideas that resonated with a culture that prized the ability to remain composed under pressure, to serve the state without complaint, to bear hardship with dignity. The language of Stoic virtue fitted, imperfectly but genuinely, into the language of Roman civic virtue, and the fit, however imperfect, was enough. Panaetius planted something in Rome, and what grew from it was nourished, over the following 2 centuries, by a series of philosophers whose engagement with the Stoic tradition bore less and less resemblance to the systematic technical project that Chrysippus had pursued, and more resemblance to something that might be called, without condescension, philosophical literature. Letters, essays, notebooks, lectures recorded by students. The texts that would eventually define Stoicism for nearly every subsequent reader were not treatises on Stoic logic or systematic accounts of the pneuma that holds the cosmos together. They were the records of individual minds working through, in prose rather than in formal argument, the practical and personal questions that the Stoic framework had always been built to address. The distance between the systematic philosophy of the early Stoa and the literary philosophy of the late Stoa is real, and it is worth holding without trying to collapse it into either a story of improvement or a story of decline. Chrysippus had built something extraordinary in the 3rd century BCE, an edifice of argument and analysis so thorough and so carefully constructed that it could bear enormous philosophical weight. What the philosophers who followed, centuries later, in Rome and in Greek cities under Roman rule, were doing with that edifice was different. They were living in it. They were walking through its rooms and finding the ones most useful for the specific pressures and difficulties of individual human lives. They were not less serious for this, and they were not more serious. They were working on a different problem, not how to build a structure that could survive intellectual challenge, but how to use the structure that had been built, day by day, in the small and ordinary conditions of a life that includes illness and political failure and the deaths of people one loves, and the persistent difficulty of one's own character. The tradition that Zeno began on the porch, in a public place open to anyone, structured by nothing more coercive than the willingness to listen, had traveled a long way between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st and 2nd century CE. It had crossed from Athens to Rhodes, to Rome. It had passed through the hands of men who were slaves, men who were emperors, men who were middle-class merchants and retired politicians and provincial administrators. It had been argued over and modified, and sometimes distorted, and sometimes clarified. It had acquired, along the way, the kind of complexity and internal variation that any living tradition acquires when enough people think seriously about it for long enough. And yet something in it remained consistent across all that distance and all those hands, something that had been present in the early morning light of the painted porch, when Zeno of Citium, who had lost his cargo of purple dye in a shipwreck and arrived in Athens with almost nothing, began to argue that the loss of a ship's cargo, and the loss of one's reputation, and the loss of one's health, and the loss of one's freedom, that none of these, finally, touched the thing that most needed to be protected. The thing most worth protecting was also, by fortunate coincidence, the thing that could not be taken. It was not cargo, it was not dye, it was not wealth or health or the approval of others. It was the faculty by which a person assesses all of these things, the capacity to reason, to judge, to choose one's response in full awareness of what the world is and what it is not.
And
From the elaborate logical architecture of Chrysippus to the evening notebooks of a Roman emperor writing to himself by lamplight on a military campaign, the Stoic tradition was always, underneath its technical complexity, working on the same problem in the same place, the interior of a human being trying to understand what is actually theirs to hold. The great systematic project, the logic and the physics and the carefully structured ethics, was built to surround and support the smaller, quieter inquiry. And over the centuries, as the technical ambition gradually softened and the practical urgency came to the foreground, it became clear that the inquiry had never needed the grandeur to be valid. It had always been available, always been workable, in the still and particular space of a single person thinking, late in the day, about what genuinely matters and what, with patience and without drama, can simply be let go. Arian of Nicomedia was not yet 30 when he walked each morning to the lecture hall in Nicopolis and sat in the presence of a man who had been born into slavery and never forgot what that meant. He carried his tablet not because his teacher had asked him to. He carried it because what he was hearing seemed too urgent and too precisely useful to exist only in the air where it had been spoken. The lectures of Epictetus had no written form. They arrived each day in spoken sentences, unprepared and direct, and they had the quality of something that had been thought through so completely that the thinking had become invisible, the way long practice makes a skilled hand appear effortless. Arian wrote because what was being said in that room felt to the person hearing it for the first time like something that could change the interior arrangement of a life. What he compiled eventually became the Enchiridion. The word means something like a handbook, something carried in the hand, close to the body, available for daily use. It was not a monument or a treatise. It was a portable daily reference, designed to be returned to rather than completed, the way a person returns to a particular piece of writing, not to learn something new from it, but to be reminded of something they already know and keep forgetting. The Enchiridion is short. It begins without ceremony. Its first sentence reads, "Some things are in our control, and others are not." That sentence does not announce itself as the beginning of anything. It has the flatness of something already known, a statement so obvious that a person reading it for the first time might pass over it entirely, assuming they understand it, moving toward the more interesting parts. But the more interesting parts keep returning to this sentence. The whole of Stoic practical philosophy keeps returning to this sentence. It is not obvious in the way it first appears. The distinction it draws is clean and simple in its form and almost impossible to maintain in practice, and the distance between knowing the distinction and actually living by it is the space in which nearly all of Epictetus's teaching takes place. The things in our control, he writes, are our opinions, our impulses, our desires, and our aversions. The things not in our control are our bodies, our reputations, our property, and the actions of other people. This is the division. It seems at first like a reasonable sorting, an organizing principle, useful for thinking clearly about what to pursue and what to release. But the further the thought is followed, the more radical the sorting becomes, because almost nothing in ordinary life is placed on the correct side of this line without effort. A person who is insulted by someone they respect feels, with great immediacy, that something genuinely theirs has been harmed. A person who loses a position they have worked for feels with great certainty that something genuinely good has been taken from them. A person lying awake in the early hours, going over a conversation that did not go well, feels, with no question at all, that what is keeping them awake is the conversation, the other person, the words that were said. None of that is the Stoic account. The Stoic account places the conversation outside the line. It places the other person's behavior outside the line. It places the job, the position, the reputation, and the body itself outside the line. What remains inside the line is not nothing, but it is much smaller than the territory most people treat as their own, and its smallness is at first unsettling before it becomes, for those who follow the thought far enough, a source of something closer to relief. Epictetus used a Greek term for the faculty he was pointing toward, prohairesis. It is usually translated as rational choice or moral will, and the translation is accurate, though it misses the specific quality of the thing Epictetus had in mind. Prohairesis is not merely the capacity to make decisions. It is the faculty of judgment itself, the part of a person that receives experience and evaluates it, assents to propositions, or withholds assent, chooses the orientation with which to meet what arrives. It is, Epictetus said, the only thing a person genuinely owns. Everything else, the body, the house, the relationships, the reputation, is borrowed, conditional, subject at any moment to alteration by forces that do not consult the borrower. But the faculty of judgment, the capacity to meet experience in one way or another, to hold a view or revise it, to orient toward what happens with understanding, rather than panic, that cannot be taken, it can only be surrendered. And the surrender is always an act the person makes themselves, even when they do not recognize it as one. He knew what he was saying from the inside. Epictetus had been a slave in the household of Epaphroditus, a freedman and secretary in the court of Nero, and the conditions of that life were not theoretical. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal but philosophically useful, of his master twisting his leg, and Epictetus remarking, with measured calm, that if he continued in that direction the leg would break. The leg broke. The response in the story is the same measured calm. Did he not say it would break? Whether or not the event occurred exactly as described, something true is being pointed toward in the telling. The slave has identified a domain that the master does not enter, not a domain of power or comfort or safety. None of those are available to the slave, and Epictetus never pretends otherwise, but a domain of clear appraisal, of judgment not distorted by fear or false hope, of a mind that has sorted what is genuinely its own from what was never truly available to begin with. The master holds the leg. The master does not hold the faculty of judgment still operating clearly behind the eyes. This is the thought that gives the dichotomy of control its force. It is not an invitation to passive withdrawal from the world, though it has sometimes been misread that way. Epictetus was not teaching his students to stop caring about outcomes. He was teaching them to locate their caring correctly, to invest in what is genuinely theirs, and hold the rest with a lighter hand, not because the rest is unimportant, but because the quality of the holding matters more than the thing held. A person who clings to reputation with the grip of someone clinging to a genuine good will be miserable whenever reputation shifts, which is often A person who values reputation as something worth pursuing through honest means, but is not constituted by it, is free to pursue it without being enslaved to it. The distinction is not between caring and not caring. It is between the kind of caring that leaves the practitioner at the mercy of every fluctuation and the kind that does not. The word Epictetus reaches for in describing that first mislocated kind of caring is confusion. The root of human unhappiness, in his account, is not bad luck, and it is not injustice, and it is not the actions of other people, though all of those things cause suffering, and none of them should be minimized. The root is confusion, the persistent, almost automatic misidentification of what is genuinely ours. A person calls their reputation their own, and then is undone when someone damages it. A person calls their health their own, and then loses their footing when illness arrives. A person calls the behavior of someone they love their own, and then experiences every departure from expectation as a kind of injury. In each case, the confusion is the same. Something outside the line has been dragged across it and treated as though it belonged on the inside. And when it does what external things always eventually do, shift, diminish, disappear, the suffering that follows has the particular character of a loss that was never quite a possession. The Stoic work is the patient, repeated correction of this confusion, not once, not in a single clear-eyed reading of the Enchiridion. The correction needs to happen again and again because the confusion is not a mistake a person makes occasionally and then recovers from. It is the default orientation of an untrained mind, the way the mind reaches for external things to hold its sense of itself together, and the reaching is fast and unconscious and happens before any philosophical training has a chance to intervene. This is why Arrian wrote the lectures down. This is why Epictetus recommended returning to the Enchiridion regularly rather than mastering it once. The work is not the work of a single understanding. It is the work of a long, daily, patient reorientation, the way a plant is not directed toward light through a single act, but through the slow, continuous adjustment of every growing part. There is a kind of disturbance that visits a person in the late hours, not the dramatic disturbances, the crises and catastrophes, but the small, persistent ones that have no particular origin and no clear address. A thing said by someone during the day that continues to carry weight long after the conversation ended. A possibility that was not settled and has been carried silently into the dark. An awareness of something not yet resolved, something pending, something that could go one way or another and whose outcome cannot be controlled. These are the disturbances Epictetus was diagnosing, not the large philosophical ones, but the small, specific, ordinary ones that constitute most of the texture of a waking life. His diagnosis in each case is the same, and it is quiet and precise. Not the words, not the pending outcome, not the other person, but the underlying assessment that something genuinely good is being threatened. Something genuinely yours is at risk. That is the weight that is being carried. Change the assessment, and the weight changes. Hold the opinion correctly, and the long sleepless hours of rehearsal lose their purchase. This is what the Stoics meant when they said that emotional disturbance is caused not by events, but by judgments about events. The claim is not that the events are harmless. It is not that grief and fear and anger have no legitimate place in a human life. Epictetus did not teach a philosophy of numbness, and the later Stoics who inherited his work were careful to preserve the distinction between what they called the passions, the turbulent, judgment-saturated disturbances that arise from false evaluation, and what they allowed as natural responses to genuine loss, responses appropriate in scale, and not maintained beyond their occasion. A parent who has lost a child grieves. The Stoic does not say, "The child was not in your control, therefore this is not a real loss." The Stoic says, "The grief appropriate to this event is one thing, and the layer of torment added by the insistence that this should not have happened, that the world has done something wrong to you, that something that was genuinely yours has been stolen. That layer is a different thing, and it is the layer the philosophical work can address. The claim lands quietly the first time it is heard, then it tends to land harder, because the implication is that a significant proportion of what most people experience as suffering is, in the Stoic account, suffering they are adding to what is already there, not intentionally, not foolishly, but through the systematic misidentification of what is genuinely good, what is genuinely theirs, what is genuinely threatened when the external world refuses to cooperate. The insult hurts, but the additional suffering, the rehearsal, the imagined responses, the accumulated sense that something valuable about the self has been permanently diminished, that additional layer is a product of the judgment that the insult had access to something genuinely yours. The judgment is, in the Stoic account, false, and false judgments can in principle be corrected. In principle. Epictetus never pretended the correction was easy. The lectures collected by Arrian have a characteristic quality that runs through them, a patient impatience, a tone that acknowledges over and over that the students understand the argument clearly and are not, as a result, changed by it. Understanding the argument is not the same as holding the argument so completely that it intervenes between experience and response. That intervention, the small pause between the event and the reaction in which the judgment can be reviewed and, if necessary, revised, is the product not of understanding, but of practice, the kind that happens repeatedly and over a long time, the kind that is lost and found again, and lost again and found again, and does not ever become permanent in the way a skill eventually becomes permanent. The Stoic mind is not a trained reflex. It is a trained willingness to return to the work again and again as many times as the confusion reasserts itself, which is often. Arrian sat in that lecture hall and wrote. He did not know what he was preserving. He knew only that the man speaking was describing something true about the interior life with a precision he had not heard from anyone else, and that the precision had the quality of being, in some sense, prior to argument, not a conclusion that a skilled dialectician had arrived at, but a description of what was actually there, in the mind, in the daily experience of confusion and disturbance, and the tentative discoveries of a cleaner way to hold the things that arrive. Marcus Aurelius never sat in a lecture hall in Nicopolis. He was born in the year Arrian was writing, and he came to Epictetus through the written record rather than the spoken teaching. But his encounter with the Enchiridion and with the broader Stoic tradition left marks that are visible on every page of the notebooks he kept for decades and never showed to anyone. The Meditations, the title was given to the notebooks later by others, and is not Marcus's own, are the most intimate Stoic document that survives. They were not written for publication. They were not written to persuade. They are a private practice, the philosophical equivalent of what Epictetus had been recommending to his students, not a record of positions held and defended, but a workshop in which the mind is corrected, the judgments reviewed, the confusions named, and placed back on the correct side of the line. The specific texture of the Meditations matters here, because the voice in those notebooks is not calm. It is not the voice of a man who has mastered the practice and is writing from the settled ground of achieved equanimity. It is the voice of a man who needs to be told the same things repeatedly, who reminds himself of the same principles from different angles, who returns to the same difficulties with what reads as genuine frustration, not at the world, but at himself, at the persistence of his own bad habits of judgment. He is Emperor of Rome while he is writing. He has been managing wars and plagues and the fractious politics of a court he cannot fully trust for years by the time the notebooks reach their most sustained passages. He cannot control how the senators will behave in tomorrow's session. He cannot control the course of the plague moving through the provinces. He cannot control what will be written about him after his death, or whether what he has built will survive the people who come after him. He knows this. He writes it down in plain and sometimes blunt language, as though addressing a student who needs to hear it more than once, which is exactly what he is doing. The student he is addressing is himself. This is what makes the Meditations unlike almost any other philosophical text. Most philosophical writing, even when it is personal in tone, has at least the formal structure of an argument addressed to a general reader. Marcus is not arguing. He is reminding. The difference matters. An argument is addressed to someone who might disagree. A reminder is addressed to someone who already knows and keeps forgetting. The Meditations are a document of forgetting and returning, of losing the correct orientation and finding it again, of the same fundamental insight, held and lost and held again across decades of a life that was, by any external measure, one of the most demanding in the ancient world. What he kept returning to was the dichotomy. In book after book of the Meditations, in different forms and from different angles, the same sorting occurs. What is mine? What is not mine? Where should the weight of my caring rest? He names external things as they press on him, the ingratitude of people he has trusted, the slowness of the bureaucratic machinery he is trying to direct, the deaths he watches accumulate during the Antonine Plague, and in each case the movement is the same. The external event is named, its weight is acknowledged. And then the sorting. This is outside the line, and my response to it is inside the line, and the response is what I actually have access to, and the response is enough if I hold it correctly. He does not always find the sorting easy. Some entries read as genuine struggle. He writes of waking in the morning unwilling to face the day, and reminds himself that the work is what he was made for, that a bee does not hang back from the work of being a bee, and the self-correction has the quality of a man pushing himself to his feet and not finding the pushing particularly inspirational. This is not the tone of someone who has arrived at Stoic equanimity through years of disciplined practice and is now describing its rewards. It is the tone of someone in the middle of the practice, finding it difficult, returning to it anyway, which is perhaps a more useful record than the other kind would have been. The notebooks were found after his death. He had not prepared them for any reader, whatever he intended by keeping them, and scholars have speculated about this without arriving at agreement. They were not intended as a gift to posterity or as a guide for future practitioners. They were the practice itself, made visible by the accident of survival. A person sits in a dark room and writes to themselves about what they are getting wrong and what they could hold differently, and the writing is the discipline, the physical act of returning to the page, the same as the interior act of returning to the correct orientation. The Stoic dichotomy of control is not a framework to be understood and then applied from a safe distance. It is a practice to be returned to, again and again in private, when no one is watching. This is one of the things Epictetus understood with great clarity from his position in that lecture hall, that philosophical truth, the kind that actually changes the way a person lives, does not transfer through lectures. It does not transfer through reading, though reading can help. It requires the practitioner to do something, not an outer something, not a changed behavior in the world, but an inner something, the repeated act of noticing a judgment as it forms and evaluating its accuracy before letting it settle into the operating assumptions that will govern the next hour. The lecture can point toward this practice. The Enchiridion can remind a person to do it, but the doing is always private and always individual and always at some level alone. Epictetus had been alone in that sense for most of his life. Whatever the specific conditions of his slavery, and they were variable, some slaves in wealthy Roman households led relatively comfortable material lives. Others did not. He had inhabited from an early age a condition that forced the dichotomy into sharp relief. The things outside the line were clearer when their absence from one's control was not a philosophical claim, but a daily fact. When the body, the movements, the labor, the daily conditions are not governed by the person inhabiting them, the question of what remains genuinely one's own becomes not a theoretical exercise, but a pressing practical necessity. Epictetus's answer to that question was not arrived at from a position of philosophical comfort. It was forged in conditions that left very little room for the consolation of preferred indifference. And yet what the answer produces, when it is genuinely held, is not the grim endurance of a person who has made peace with diminishment. It is something closer to what Epictetus actually communicated in those lectures, a quality of freedom that has no dependence on circumstance, because it has found its ground in something circumstance does not touch. The slave in the lecture hall, long since freed, teaching in a converted bathhouse in the city of Nicopolis, speaks without notes to a room full of students who are there by choice, in comfortable enough conditions, with no external force requiring anything of them at all. And what he is offering them is the same thing that had been available to him in the worst of his conditions, the knowledge that the faculty of rational choice, correctly understood, is not something that can be taken. It is a strange knowledge. It does not make circumstances better. It does not make loss unfelt, or illness comfortable, or injustice harmless. What it does, what the Stoics consistently claim it does, what the students who followed the practice carefully tended to report, is change the relationship to circumstance in a way that leaves the practitioner less at its mercy, less buffeted, able to feel what the situation calls for feeling without being determined by it. The weight of the world still comes, the difference is in what receives it. Arrian understood enough of what he was hearing to know that the understanding was not the point. He wrote the lectures down, not to preserve arguments, but to preserve the living quality of the instruction, the specific way Epictetus moved between abstract principle and concrete example, the dry humor, the blunt willingness to tell students that they understood the theory perfectly and had not yet done the harder thing. Arrian had done the harder thing himself, at least partially and incompletely, as the Stoics acknowledged everyone did it. He had returned to the Enchiridion in his own life. He had found it, as the Stoics promised practitioners would find it, inexhaustible in its application, not because it contained many ideas, but because its single organizing idea has territory in almost every hour of a waking life. There is a quality specific to that single idea when it is genuinely absorbed, rather than merely understood, a quality that is difficult to describe without making it sound either simpler or more dramatic than it is. It is not liberation in any theatrical sense. It is quieter than that. It is more like a small but permanent shift in where the center of gravity rests, a relocation of the self's most fundamental investment from the territory of things that can be altered by fortune to the territory of things that cannot. The investment does not disappear from the rest of life. Marcus still cared what happened to the empire. Epictetus still preferred freedom to slavery in the category of things worth pursuing through legitimate means. The Stoics were not indifferent to the world in the sense of being untouched by it. They were engaged with it differently, through the understanding that none of the external things, including the most valued ones, constitute what a person actually is. What a person actually is in the Stoic account is the faculty of judgment, prohairesis, the capacity to assess and orient and choose, not the body that carries it, not the reputation that surrounds it, not the relationships that sustain it, not the empire that depends on it. Those things matter in their appropriate category, but none of them are the person. The person is the evaluating, choosing, orienting center, the part that can be honest or dishonest, courageous or cowardly, clear-eyed or confused, and that part, whatever happens to the body or the position or the possessions, remains available for the practice. The practice is always possible. That is the Stoic promise, which is not a promise about outcomes, but about access. Whatever the circumstances, the work of coming to see clearly is always available to the person for whom clarity is still an aspiration. Marcus Aurelius wrote his notebooks over many years and across many circumstances, some of them moderately comfortable, many of them not. He wrote on campaign, he wrote during the plague, he wrote in the ordinary difficult intervals of a reign that lasted nearly 2 decades and brought its full measure of grief and frustration and the particular loneliness that seems to accompany the exercise of great power. The notebooks were never finished because the practice they documented was never finished. There is no final entry in which Marcus announces that the work is complete, the confusion resolved, the correct orientation permanently established. The notebooks end because his life ended, not because the practice arrived at its destination. This is perhaps the most honest thing about them. The Stoic dichotomy of control is not a technique that, once mastered, renders the practitioner immune to confusion. It is a direction of travel. The practitioner moves toward it and loses ground and moves toward it again. The movement does not complete. What changes over years of honest practice is not the completion, but the familiarity with the returning, the decreasing surprise that the confusion has reasserted itself, the increasing ease of finding the line again and sorting correctly again, the gradual deepening of a quality that has no good single word in English, but that the Stoics found adequate in the word apatheia, which means not absence of feeling, but absence of distorting passion, the clean capacity to feel what is actually appropriate to feel without the layered suffering added by false judgment. Marcus never intended his notebooks to be read by anyone. He was not writing for the person in the future who would lie awake in a dark room centuries later and find in his private self-corrections a kind of companionship. He was writing for himself in the specific and immediate sense, addressing the particular confusion of a particular evening, naming the particular mistaken assessment that needed naming, placing the day's accumulated weight back on the correct side of the line before sleep arrived. The notebooks were a discipline performed in private, which is the only place the Stoic dichotomy of control can finally be taken up. The argument can be heard in a lecture hall. The enchiridion can be carried and consulted. But the moment in which the judgment is actually reviewed and corrected, that moment happens alone, in the dark, in the space between what has arrived and what the mind chooses to make of it. It is a very small space. It is easy to miss. The untrained mind crosses it so quickly that the movement seems to have no middle, only the event and then the reaction, with no interval in which anything could have been different. What the practice of Stoic philosophy does, slowly and incompletely, and with many reversals, is widen that interval, not dramatically, not to the point where the practitioner stands serene above every disturbance, but enough to allow the question to be asked: is this judgment accurate, and does the thing I am treating as threatened actually belong on my side of the line? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes what is at stake is genuinely the person's own, genuinely within the territory of proheresis, genuinely a matter of the character and clarity with which they meet what is arriving. In those cases, the weight is real and the practice does not diminish it. In the other cases, the cases that make up most of what keeps a person awake in the early hours, most of the rehearsal and the accumulated agitation and the imagined responses to things already said, in those cases, the question asked by the dichotomy has the quality of a door quietly opening, not onto anything dramatic, onto the recognition that the thing pressing for attention is outside the line, that it cannot be corrected by continued attention, that the effort being spent in the dark to resolve it is effort applied to territory that was never available for that kind of resolution. The weight does not disappear when this is recognized, but it shifts. The center of gravity finds its proper location, and somewhere in that shift, the night stops requiring anything. Marcus wrote his notebooks and did not show them to anyone, and they were found after his death and eventually arrived through a long and unlikely chain of preservation to the world that would read them. But the act of writing them, the private act of returning to the page, the patient blunt self-correction, the repeated sorting of what was his from what was not, that act was complete in itself, requiring no future reader and no continuity beyond the night in which it was performed. The dichotomy of control is not a performance for anyone watching. It is not a philosophy displayed in public or argued for in debate. It is a practice taken up alone, returned to alone, and useful precisely because it asks nothing of anyone but the person holding it, in the quiet, without an audience, as often as is necessary, which turns out to be again and again and without end. Cleantius wrote his hymn in the early hours, before the city had fully woken, in the kind of quiet that belongs only to those who have been awake long enough to own it. He was not a young man when he wrote it. He had spent decades carrying water by night and thinking by day, and the patience of that arrangement had given his ideas a particular quality, not the brightness of someone who arrived at a conclusion quickly, but the steadiness of someone who had lived beside a thought long enough to know its whole shape. The hymn he wrote was addressed to Zeus, which in the tradition he had inherited meant something much older and stranger and more intimate than a god sitting on a mountain. It meant the rational fire woven through everything. It meant the principle by which stone coheres, by which a root finds water in the dark, by which a human mind turns and asks what it is and why it is here, and why the asking itself feels like something more than accident. The name the Stoics gave to this principle was logos. The word is ancient and carries more weight than any single translation can hold. It has been rendered as reason, as word, as rational order, as the cosmic mind. But what the Stoics meant by it was something at once simpler and harder to absorb than any of those translations suggests. They meant that the universe is not merely moving, but thinking. They meant that the order visible in the turning of seasons, in the way fire rises and water falls, in the way a human argument can be sound or unsound, according to principles that did not have to exist but do. They meant that all of this is the expression of a single rational intelligence, immanent in matter itself, not standing outside the world and directing it, but constituting the world from within, the way warmth constitutes a fire, rather than being added to it afterward. This was not a comforting metaphor. The Stoics took it as a literal account of what exists. They were, in the terms their tradition had available, thoroughgoing materialists, which means they believed that everything real is in some sense physical, even the soul, even God, even the Logos itself. What they called pneuma was a fine mixture of fire and air, something between the physical and the vital, and it moved through all things at different tensions, different intensities of presence, producing different qualities in what it inhabited. Where pneuma moved with low tension, slow and dense, it produced the cohesion of stone, the quality that makes a rock hold its shape against pressure. Where it moved at slightly higher tension, it produced the growth and nourishment of plants, the reaching upward, the turning toward light, the patient work of drawing sustenance from soil and air. Higher still, and it produced the sensation and impulse of animals, the alertness of a creature that can feel pain and pleasure and move toward what it needs. And at the highest tension of all, pneuma became rational soul, the capacity not merely to feel and respond, but to step back from the feeling and the response, to examine them, to ask whether they are correct, to choose differently than the first impulse suggested. The same substance, the same breath of the cosmos, at different tensions, expressing different faces of the same rational origin. There is something in this image that the mind can rest inside for a long time. The Stoics were not drawing a line between matter and spirit, between body and soul, between nature and mind. They were describing a spectrum, a single continuum of being in which the human capacity for thought is not an anomaly or an intrusion into the physical world, but the world's own capacity for self-reflection, briefly present, briefly gathered into the form of a person who can sit quietly and ask what all of this is. The stone in a wall does not know it is part of the world. The root of a tree does not consider its own growth. The animal in a field responds to what it finds without pausing to examine the response. But the human being, the rational soul, is the place where the logos turns and looks at itself, where the fire becomes aware of its own burning. Cleanless understood this, and what he wrote in the hymn to Zeus was not a petition or a supplication. It was not a prayer for favor from a god who might or might not be listening. It was something more like an act of recognition, the rational soul of a human being acknowledging the rational soul of everything, the way one mind acknowledges another across a room. He wrote of Zeus as the power that guides and governs all things, that makes the crooked straight and the disordered, that weaves even what seems contrary and wrong into the pattern of the whole. He wrote of the human being's task as alignment, not passive surrender to whatever happens, but the active, attentive, practiced work of bringing one's own reason into harmony with the reason that runs through everything. The harmony is the goal. The striving toward it is the practice. And the practice has no end because the Logos itself has no end. There is a doctrine in Stoic cosmology that sounds on first encounter like something extreme, like a story a philosopher tells while knowing it cannot quite be true. The Stoics called it ekpyrosis, the conflagration, and what it proposed was this: that the universe does not simply continue indefinitely in its current form, but periodically dissolves, not collapses into chaos, not unravels into meaninglessness, but returns, the whole vast structure of matter and world and history, back into the pure fire from which it came, back into the Logos itself. And then, from that fire, with patient and unhurried necessity, the cosmos reconstitutes itself, exactly as it was. Every event in the same order, every person in the same circumstances, every argument made exactly as it was made before, every evening of quiet and every dawn of uncertainty arriving again in their proper sequence, the same world, again, without deviation. A modern listener might find this vertiginous, the same life endlessly repeated with no possibility of revision. But the Stoics did not mean it as a nightmare. They held ekprosis not as a source of dread, but as confirmation, as evidence of the rational perfection and completeness of what exists. If the cosmos is truly governed by a rational principle, then the form it takes is the form that reason requires. Nothing in it is arbitrary. Nothing in it is wasted. The dissolution back into fire is not destruction, but the logos gathering itself, the way a breath is gathered before it is released. And the reconstitution is not a copy of something lost, but the same perfect expression of rational order, produced again because rational order always produces the same form when it works through the same conditions. The repetition is not tragedy. It is the rhythm of a universe that has always known exactly what it is doing. To sit with this thought, really sit with it, the way the Stoics were trained to do, is to feel the ground shift beneath a particular kind of anxiety. The anxiety that believes the world might become irrational, that things might come apart in some final and irreversible way, that the order holding daily life together is provisional and fragile. The Stoic cosmology says, no, the order is not provisional. The order is constitutive. The rational fire running through things is not a quality that could be removed from the world while leaving the world intact. It is what the world is. And because it is what the world is, there is nowhere in the universe that is outside its reach, nowhere where chaos has a permanent foothold, nowhere that is beyond the governing intelligence of the Logos. This was what the Stoics called hymarmene, fate understood, not as blind chance, not as the arbitrary decree of willful gods, but as the unbroken causal chain flowing from the Logos's rational governance of everything. Every event that occurs is part of this chain. Every thought that arises in a human mind, every choice that a rational soul makes, every outcome that follows, all of it is woven into the single vast fabric of providential order. Nothing falls outside it. The dying of a civilization, the passing of a season, the end of a day, these are not accidents interrupting the order. They are the order fully expressed. For those who have not spent time inside this framework, fate can sound like the end of choice, like the argument that nothing matters because everything is already determined. The Stoics did not read it this way. They read it as the ground of rational agency. Because the Logos is rational, because it governs through reason rather than through arbitrariness, the appropriate response to it is not submission but alignment. Not the passive acceptance of whatever happens, but the active cultivation of a soul that understands why things happen, and that can recognize the rational principle in what seems difficult or unwanted, and that can therefore choose to meet events with the equanimity of a mind that has found its footing in something that does not give way. Marcus Aurelius understood this with the particular clarity of someone who needed it daily. He was not a philosopher by temperament or inclination who happened to find himself ruling an empire. He was a man who had not chosen the weight of what he carried, who had inherited responsibilities he did not design and could not fully discharge, who had watched plagues move through his world and campaigns fail, and trusted advisors disappoint, and who had found, in the Stoic account of a rationally governed cosmos, not a way to make these things less real, but a way to stand inside their reality without being broken by it. His notebook, the private writing that was never intended for anyone but himself, records the practice of this standing, not triumphantly, not easily, but with the stubborn patience of a man who returns to the same argument every morning because the morning requires it. He wrote that a person ought to love their fate as completely as they love themselves. The instruction sits quietly on the page and requires some dwelling with before its full weight is felt. It is not an instruction to pretend that difficult things are not difficult. It is not a demand for false cheerfulness in the face of genuine suffering. It is the recognition that resistance to what has occurred is a second suffering added on top of the first by the person doing the resisting, and that this second suffering is the one that is actually within reach of philosophy. The event has happened. The event is now part of the unbroken causal chain of the Logos. To fight against its having happened, to spend energy in the futile work of wishing a different world into being, is to be twice diminished, once by the event itself, and once by the mind's refusal to let the event be what it is. To love one's fate is not the same as approving of everything that occurs. Marcus did not approve of the plague. He did not pretend that the deaths it brought were small, or that the grief of those who survived them was philosophically manageable through argument alone. What he held with great care, and with the strain that great care always carries, was the distinction between the event and the response to the event. The event belonged to the providential order, to Hymarmene, to the Logos's unbroken governance of what exists. The response belonged to the rational soul, and the rational soul's response, unlike the event itself, was always in principle within reach of wisdom. There is a long, still evening quality to the Stoic view of the cosmos that does not announce itself loudly, but that the mind, given enough quiet time, begins to feel. It is the quality of a universe that is not indifferent, not coldly mechanical, not running on without regard for the rational souls it has produced, but that is, at every point, expressing the same rational principle those souls themselves are capable of. The fire that coheres the stone is the same fire that at higher tension thinks in a human being. The governance of the whole and the governance of the self are different expressions of the same capacity. And this means that the work of philosophy, the patient, daily, never finished work of bringing one's own reasoning into alignment with the Logos, is not a human project set against the grain of the universe, but an expression of what the universe does when it reaches the form of a conscious, rational soul. The Stoics were not gentle about the implications of this. If the rational order is available to any human being who applies reason with sufficient care and honesty, then there is no circumstance, no poverty, no illness, no captivity, no grief, no loss of any kind that places a rational soul beyond the reach of philosophical practice. The Logos is present in the stone, and in the root, and in the animal, and in the human mind. It does not absent itself when the human circumstances are difficult. It does not withdraw from a slave's mourning, or a general's grief, or a plague-thinned city. It is there, at the tension appropriate to rational soul, available to anyone who has not stopped reasoning, available as ground rather than as comfort, as orientation rather than as relief. This is what made the Stoic tradition portable across the very different lives of those who carried it. A water carrier who spent his days in a lecture hall could hold the same cosmology as the philosopher who had given him the framework. A man born into slavery could understand and practice the same alignment with the Logos as a Roman emperor. The circumstances differed as widely as circumstances can differ. The philosophical ground was the same ground. The fire was the same fire. Consider what Cleanthes wrote with that in mind. He had worked through the night carrying water when he first began studying with Zeno in the Stoa Poikial. He had arrived at philosophy not through privilege or leisure, but through the same kind of difficult, ordinary commitment that most people cannot sustain and most systems do not accommodate. By the time he was writing his hymn to Zeus, he had inhabited the Stoic cosmology long enough for it to have become structural, not an idea he held, but a framework he thought from. And what he wrote was not a claim that the cosmos is comfortable, it was a claim that the cosmos is rational, that the rational fire running through all things, including the running of the water and the sitting in the lecture hall and the aging of the body that had done both, is the same fire that a human mind participates in when it thinks clearly, chooses well, and meets what comes with the equanimity that only genuine understanding can produce. The hymn is not consoling in the way a warm word is consoling. It is consoling in the way that bedrock is consoling, not soft, not yielding, but absolutely present beneath whatever is built on top of it. The Stoic tradition also held, with a careful and serious attention to what it actually meant, that the cosmos as a whole is fully good. Not good in the sense that everything within it is pleasant, or that the rational soul is spared difficulty, or that the providential order ensures outcomes a particular person might prefer. Good in the sense that the rational organization of everything, the pneuma at its full spectrum of tensions, the logos governing the whole through the same principle that a good argument governs a line of reasoning, is itself the highest form of order available, and that there is no standard external to the cosmos by which it could be found wanting. The philosopher who has genuinely absorbed this is not naive about what the world contains. They are, rather, no longer measuring the world against an imaginary alternative. They are meeting what is, where it is, with the full attention of a rational soul that has stopped requiring the world to be different before the soul is willing to be at peace. The Persian king Cyrus, moving through a conquered city, is a figure from history. The plague moving through Rome in the 2nd century is a fact of that world's experience. The particular difficulty of any given evening, the unresolved problem, the unnamed anxiety, the sense that something is slightly wrong without the wrong being anywhere the mind can precisely locate, these are part of the same unbroken chain. None of them are outside the logos. None of them are evidence that the rational order has broken down or abandoned its governance of things. They are the rational order in the form that this particular point in the causal chain requires. Marcus returned to this again and again during the Antonine Plague. He was not writing in good weather. He was writing in the presence of enormous, undeniable, ongoing loss, the kind of loss that does not resolve and does not offer the small mercies that particular griefs sometimes carry. The plague was not a single event that could be mourned and moved through. It was a condition, a long condition, that required him to govern an empire and maintain his own equanimity simultaneously and without end. The notes he wrote to himself in those conditions are not cheerful. They are not the writing of a man who has found the suffering easy, but they are the writing of a man who has found the ground, who has located, beneath the difficulty, the still fact of a rationally ordered cosmos that has not stopped being what it is because conditions are hard, and who holds on to that fact the way a person holds on to something solid when the footing around them is uncertain. He wrote that what injures the hive injures the bee. He wrote that what is not harmful to the city is not harmful to the citizen. Not as arguments for political passivity. Marcus was not passive, but as reminders that the individual rational soul is not separate from the larger rational order, that its flourishing is not in competition with the flourishing of the whole, that the logos governing the cosmos and the logos operating within a particular human mind are the same principle at different scales. To align the self with the larger order is not to dissolve the self. It is to find the self's proper orientation, the way a compass finds north, not by abandoning its own mechanism, but by allowing that mechanism to respond to what is actually there. Pneuma, moving through all things. Stone, root, animal, human thought. The same substance at different tensions, expressing the same rational origin. The slow spectrum from the stillness of mineral cohesion to the restless self-examination of a mind that cannot help but ask what it is and why, and all of it continuous, all of it connected, all of it the single logos expressing itself through every form matter takes. To feel this, even briefly, is to find a particular kind of rest, not the rest of a problem solved, not the rest of an anxiety relieved, the rest of a mind that has stepped back far enough to see that the whole vast thing is of a piece, that nothing is truly separate from the rational principle running through it, that the question being turned over in the dark is itself an expression of the same fire that turns everything. The ekbairosis, the periodic return of all things to pure fire, can be held as a source of dread, and there are evenings when its implications seem to demand that response. The same events recurring, no permanent deviation possible, the whole human history of reaching and building and hoping, dissolving and beginning again. But the Stoics held it differently, and their holding of it carries its own instruction. If the cosmos returns to the logos and reconstitutes itself according to the same rational principles, then what the reconstitution expresses is the complete sufficiency of those principles. The world that returns from the fire is not a damaged copy of something lost. It is the logos's own best expression of what rational order requires. Nothing in it is arbitrary. Nothing in it is wrong in any way that would persist through the purification of fire. The return is not a correction, it is a confirmation. A person lying still in the dark, breathing slowly, might consider what this means for the particular weight of tonight, the unfinished thought, the unresolved question, the thing that happened and has not yet settled into its final shape in the mind. All of it is part of the unbroken chain. All of it is the logos, working through this particular arrangement of circumstance in consciousness, producing exactly this specific quality of late tiredness, this particular texture of the dark, this quiet that is not quite silence. The rational fire running through the stone in the wall, and through the root in the cold ground outside, and through the slow, warm breathing of the body lying still, is the same fire that produces the thought turning over in the mind right now, at this tension, at this hour. The Stoic philosopher does not ask to be removed from the chain. The Stoic philosopher asks only to understand it well enough to meet what comes without the second suffering of unnecessary resistance, to find, beneath whatever is present, the difficulty, the loss, the uncertainty, the ordinary unremarkable tiredness of a late evening, the still ground of a cosmos that has not stopped being rational, that has not stopped being ordered, that has not stopped being, at every point and in every form, the expression of the one principle that makes understanding itself possible. Marcus wrote, "Love your fate as completely as you love yourself. Not love what hurts, not love what has taken things away, not love the difficulty as though difficulty were desirable. Love the fact that this is the world, and that this world, this particular arrangement of fire and air and rational soul and late night quiet, is the Logos's own expression of what exists, not a mistake, not a falling short of something better. The world, the rational principle has produced, meeting the rational soul it has produced, in the specific moment of this evening, with all of its weight and all of its stillness and all of its open, unhurried dark. The fire has been burning since before there were minds to notice it burning. It will go on burning when this particular evening has been carried into the past, and the past has become another thread in the long fabric of the providential chain. Cleanve knew this, sitting in the early morning, with his hymn not yet finished, the water carrying done, the day not yet begun, the fire in the thought turning in his mind, and the fire in the logos governing the morning, and the fire in the sun beginning to find the edge of the horizon, were, in the Stoic account, the same fire at different tensions, expressing the same origin, arriving at the same destination, which was always already itself. The rational order holds it has held through the rise and dissolution of cities, through the long argument of philosophy across centuries, through the quiet of any particular evening in which a rational soul sits still, long enough to feel the ground beneath the difficulty and recognize it as ground, not as comfort, not as the erasure of what is hard, as the still, enormous, unbreakable fact that the universe is not chaos, requiring endurance, but reason requiring alignment, and that the alignment, whenever the rational soul turns toward it with honest attention, is always available, always present, always here. The Logos does not require anything from the mind that is resting now, except that it be what it is, rational, breathing, present in the order that holds everything. Somewhere beneath the turning of thought, the same fire that coheres the stone and reaches upward through the root and moves in the long patient governance of everything is present here too, at the tension appropriate to a rational soul, settling slowly into the dark, finding the ground, and allowing what does not need to be held to be, at last released. Chrysippus worked through an argument that most philosophers before him had been content to leave half finished. The passions, he said, fear, anger, grief, desire, were not forces that arrived from outside reason and overwhelmed it. They were not horses pulling a chariot in the wrong direction, while reason held uselessly at the reins. They were something stranger and more hopeful than that. They were reason itself, but reasoning wrongly. They were judgments, specific, correctable assessments of the world, dressed in the felt clothing of feeling, and if they were judgments, then the path through them was not suppression, it was understanding. This was not a comfortable position to defend. Anyone who has sat inside genuine anger, or genuine grief, or the particular cold weight of fear before sleep, knows how little those states feel like conclusions that could simply be revised. They feel like weather, they feel like gravity. Chrysippus acknowledged the feeling and pressed past it, patient in the way that only someone who had spent decades rebuilding a school's philosophical architecture could afford to be patient. And what he found on the other side of that pressure was not the elimination of emotional life, but something far more useful, a precise account of where inside a person the trouble was actually living. The trouble was living in a judgment about value. It was always, underneath its surface agitation, a claim about what mattered and what did not, about what genuinely belonged to a person, and what could therefore genuinely be taken from them. And the great Stoic insight, the one Chrysippus spent those 700 works circling and refining, was this: almost nothing that seems to belong to a person actually belongs to them, and almost everything they fear losing is not theirs to lose. To arrive at that insight fully required working backward through the whole of Stoic ethics, from its foundational claim about the good, down through the architecture of virtue, and into the specific texture of what a well-ordered life actually looked like from the inside. Chrysippus had inherited that foundational claim from the Cynics, filtered through Zeno, and he did not so much revise it as examine it, until its implications became unmistakable. The claim was simple in statement and quietly radical in consequence. Virtue alone is genuinely good. Everything else, health, wealth, pleasure, reputation, the comfort of a warm room, and an untroubled day, is indifferent. Not bad, not to be refused when it arrives, but not good. Not in the sense that matters, not good in the sense that its absence can make a life genuinely worse. A student sitting with this claim for the first time might feel it as austerity. It sounds, on first hearing, like a philosophy that is withdrawing permission. Permission to want things, to enjoy things, to feel the ordinary pull of the world's offerings as something that matters. But that is not quite what Chrysippus was doing. What he was doing was drawing a distinction between two different kinds of mattering. There is the mattering of things that genuinely bear on whether a person is living a good human life. And there is the mattering of things that feel urgent, that attract and repel and preoccupy, but that are finally, when examined clearly, beside the point of what a person is actually for. The distinction is not always comfortable to draw. A person lying awake, turning over a financial worry, or the particular sting of being passed over for something they wanted, or the dull, persistent ache of a friendship that has gone wrong. That person knows exactly how much those things seem to matter. Chrysippus would not have denied the seeming. He would have asked what kind of mattering was underneath it, and whether the loss of health or money or reputation actually threatened the thing in a person that cannot be threatened, the capacity to reason, to choose well, to act from genuine understanding of what a good human life requires. That capacity was what the Stoics called virtue, and it was not a quality that circumstances could take. The four virtues that the Stoic tradition identified, wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance, had been a shared inheritance from earlier Greek philosophy, familiar to anyone who had read Plato or followed the threads of Aristotle. But Chrysippus and the Stoics did something with them that the earlier tradition had not quite done. They insisted that the four were not four separate qualities, catalogued and independent, but a single excellence of rational character seen from four directions. To be genuinely courageous required knowing what was actually worth facing, which required wisdom. To be genuinely just required the temperance that prevents self-interest from masquerading as principle. Wisdom without the willingness to act on it was not yet wisdom, it was only information, which is a different and lesser thing. Each virtue, followed to its actual root, opened into all the others, and all of them opened, finally, into the same ground, the rational soul, functioning as it was designed to function, living in alignment with what it actually is. This had an implication that took a moment to settle. If the virtues were unified, and if virtue was the only genuine good, then a person could not be partially virtuous in the way they might be partially wealthy or partially healthy. A person either had the excellence of rational character, or they were, in some sense, still working toward it. The Stoic tradition acknowledged the starkness of this position and did not flinch from it. The sage, the Sophos, was the name they gave to the person who had actually arrived. Every judgment correct, every desire appropriate, every response to the world flowing from a clear and undistorted understanding of what genuinely mattered. The sage did not need to deliberate about whether to act with integrity when integrity was costly. Integrity was what the sage was made of, and the question of cost did not arise. How often did such a person actually appear? The ancient Stoics asked this question themselves, and their answers were wry without being evasive. Perhaps once in many generations, perhaps as a philosophical ideal that reality only ever approached without reaching. Chrysippus, who was not known for false comfort, seems to have thought the sage was so rare as to be nearly theoretical. But this did not make the ideal useless. A compass is not useless because it cannot reach north. The sage pointed in a direction, and that direction was workable. A person who could not be a sage could still ask in any given moment what the perfectly rational person would do, not as a performance to be measured against, but as a quiet interior question that steadied the hand before a choice. This is part of what made Stoic ethics genuinely livable rather than merely admirable. It did not demand perfection before it would offer anything. It offered the direction and asked only for honest motion in that direction. A person who was patient where they had been impatient yesterday, who found a way to act with fairness when self-interest was pressing, who let a small anger pass without following it into the day, that person was practicing Stoic virtue, even if they were nowhere near the sage. Even if the sage was a concept they might spend a lifetime approaching and never arrive at, the practice was the point. The motion toward was already the life-changing. What Chrysippus added to this was the precise philosophical account of why the practice was necessary in the first place. Human beings were not by default rational. They were capable of reason. This was their defining feature, the thing that set them apart from animals, the thing that linked them to the rational structure of the universe itself. But capability and actuality are not the same thing. A person is capable of speaking truthfully, and sometimes speaks from fear or vanity or the desire to avoid discomfort. A person is capable of acting justly, and sometimes acts from the distorted priorities that Chrysippus located at the root of every false judgment. The work of Stoic ethics was the work of bringing actuality into alignment with capacity, of becoming what, in the deepest sense, a human being already is. The category that made this practical, rather than merely ideal, was what the Stoics called preferred indifference. The phrase is slightly awkward, but the idea is precise and genuinely useful. There were things that a rational person, all else being equal, would naturally prefer: health over illness, enough food over hunger, warmth over cold, the company of people they cared about over isolation. These were not goods in the Stoic technical sense. They did not bear on the central question of whether a person was living virtuously. But they were not nothing. A person who was ill could still be virtuous. But it was entirely reasonable to prefer not being ill, and entirely appropriate to take action to preserve health, as long as the action did not require compromising something genuinely good: honesty, integrity, the quality of rational character, for the sake of something merely preferred. This distinction resolved a problem that otherwise made Stoic ethics look like an inhuman exercise in detachment. The Stoics were not recommending indifference to the world's goods. They were recommending a particular relationship to those goods, one in which they were pursued through appropriate means, appreciated when they arrived, and released without catastrophe when they did not. The person who lost their savings was not required by Stoic ethics to feel nothing. They were required to feel the loss with clear eyes, to see it as the loss of a preferred indifferent, not as the loss of something genuinely good, not as the destruction of the thing in them that was actually worth protecting. Seneca, writing from a life that moved between enormous wealth and sudden exile, understood this distinction with the particular sharpness of someone who had been tested by it rather than merely considering it philosophically. He had spent time at the court of Nero, which was not a place that made philosophical equanimity easy to maintain. He had been wealthy enough to be one of the wealthiest men in Rome, and had been prepared when the moment came to let the wealth go. Whether he always succeeded in practicing what he wrote is a question that his critics raised in his own lifetime and that has stayed open since. But the philosophy he articulated, in letters, in essays, in the slow, careful work of his later years, was not made dishonest by his imperfection. It was made, if anything, more honest. He was describing a practice, not a destination. He was describing something he was working at, not something he had completed. The four virtues in Seneca's hands became less a taxonomy and more a texture, the felt quality of a mind moving through the world with care. Wisdom for Seneca was less about knowing the right philosophical arguments than about knowing in the moment of actual decision what actually mattered. Courage was the willingness to face what was genuinely difficult without exaggerating the threat or shrinking from the demand. Justice was the consistent orientation toward others' well-being, even when self-interest suggested otherwise. Temperance was not austerity, but proportion, the ability to hold pleasure lightly enough that its absence did not become a grief and its presence did not become a dependency. These were qualities that showed up in the small decisions more than the large ones. The large decisions, the ones that feel weighty, that announce themselves as moments of moral significance, were in a sense easier. The stakes are visible, the question is clear. The harder work was the continuous, mostly unnoticed practice of orientation, the small adjustment toward patience, the small refusal of the comfort that would cost something quiet and interior, the slight but daily effort of keeping the hierarchy of goods clear when the world was pressing hard in favor of getting them confused. There is a quality of attention that the Stoic tradition kept returning to, a particular kind of watching the self without judgment, without drama, without the secondary disturbance of being disturbed. Epictetus described it in the bluntest possible terms. The faculty of judgment was the one thing that could not be touched, not the body, which could be harmed, not the reputation, which could be damaged, not the relationships, which could be severed, but the quality of the mind's own activity, the capacity to assess, to choose, to place value where value was due. This remained as long as the person holding it did not corrupt it themselves. This was not a consolation. It was a philosophical claim, and Epictetus seems to have made it with the directness of someone who had tested it in conditions that would have undermined almost any other philosophy. He had lived as a slave. His name was not originally his own name, but a word that simply meant property, a word that registered his status as a thing that belonged to someone else. The account that survives of his master twisting his leg, whether historically exact or philosophically illustrative, carries the weight of someone describing something they understood from the inside, not from a distance, and the position Epictetus held in that account was not the position of someone finding a way to make the pain bearable through mental discipline. It was the position of someone who had worked through the argument completely enough to know, with something approaching genuine certainty, that the thing being damaged was not the thing that mattered. The leg was preferred indifferent. The body was preferred indifferent. The faculty of judgment behind the eyes, the faculty that was, at that moment, observing the event with philosophical clarity and not losing itself in it, that was not preferred indifferent, that was the only real thing in the room. The argument does not soften the pain. Chrysippus never claimed it would. The Stoic diagnosis of suffering was not that suffering could be made to disappear through correct thinking, but that the additional suffering, the grief about the grief, the fear about the fear, the sense that the world had done something to one's core, that the world had no power to do, could be reduced to nothing by understanding what the core actually was and what it was actually made of. A person sitting with a grief they cannot put down knows the difference between the grief itself and the story around the grief. The grief is what it is, a real thing with real weight that does not respond to argument. But around the grief there is often a further structure, the sense that this loss has made the person's life worse in some permanent and essential way, that something has been removed that cannot be replaced, that the self is diminished and will not fully recover. This further structure is where the Chrysippan analysis does its work. It does not touch the grief. It touches the assessment of what the grief means, what it says about the self, what it claims about the capacity for a good life that remains even after the loss. The assessment can be corrected. The grief runs its course. But the story that the grief is a verdict on the quality of one's remaining life, that story can be examined, and the examination tends to dissolve it. This is what Chrysippus meant when he said the passions were judgments, not that they felt like judgments, not that they announced themselves as assessments that could be submitted for review, but that underneath their felt weight, underneath their texture of urgency and color and physical sensation, there was always a claim being made about value, a claim that could be looked at, turned over, held up to the clearer light of what the tradition had worked out about what was genuinely good and what was merely preferred. Marcus Aurelius held this view with the particular weariness of someone who had to apply it under conditions that made application extremely difficult. He was not a philosopher who had chosen a philosophical life. He was an emperor who had preferred a philosophical life and had been given everything else instead. He had inherited a plague that killed millions across the empire. He had inherited wars on the northern frontier that kept him away from Rome for years at a time. He had inherited senators whose behavior he could not govern and whose character he could not improve by wishing it otherwise. And into his private notebooks written in Greek, apparently for no audience but himself, he returned again and again to the same corrections. What is and is not up to him, what he can and cannot improve by wanting it to change. The distinction between the opinions of others about him, which were not his to control, and his own interior quality, which was he wrote these corrections with the bluntness of someone who did not trust himself to maintain the understanding without it. He wrote them the way a person writes a reminder that they know they will need again tomorrow. The philosophy was not background to his life. It was the active daily work of keeping himself oriented in conditions that were trying, constantly, to disorient him. The four virtues appear throughout the meditations, not as a list he was consulting, but as a structure he was checking himself against. Was the response he was considering actually wise, or was it merely politically useful? Was the action courageous, or was the appearance of courage covering a different and less admirable motivation? Was the relationship to power, the enormous, unprecedented power of being Roman emperor, being held with temperance, with proportion, or was it gradually becoming something he mistook for himself? The self-examination was not gentle. Marcus wrote to himself the way a clear-eyed person writes to someone they respect too much to be soft with. The corrections were precise, the standard was high, the tone was patient, but not comfortable. What emerges from the meditations as a whole, from the 12 books of private notes that survived against probability and Marcus's own preference, is not the portrait of a sage. Marcus did not claim to be a sage, and would have found the suggestion embarrassing in a way that was not false modesty. What emerges is the portrait of a person trying, with genuine seriousness and genuine consistency, to move in the direction the compass pointed, getting it wrong, returning to the argument, correcting the judgment, not arriving exactly, but never stopping the motion toward. The Stoic tradition did not require arrival, it required the motion. There is a way in which the foundational ethical claim that virtue alone is good sounds, at first, like it is making the world smaller. It sounds like it is drawing a perimeter around the self and declaring that everything outside the perimeter is ultimately beside the point. But this is not quite what it does when it is actually lived rather than merely understood philosophically. What it does when it is lived is change the relationship to the things outside the perimeter. It does not make them irrelevant. It makes them available, available to be sought and enjoyed and worked toward, without the desperate quality that comes from believing that their absence would constitute a real harm to the real self. Health pursued without the terror that its loss would be a catastrophe. Friendship cultivated without the grasping quality that comes from believing that another person's presence is what makes a life worth living. Work approached with the full engagement that comes from caring about doing it well, without the anxiety that comes from believing that its outcome determines something essential about the self. This is what the preferred indifference opened up when the distinction was actually clear, not detachment from the world, but a freer relationship to it. The hand open, not closed, the thing received and held without the whitening of knuckles. Chrysippus's argument about the passions was, in the end, the most intimate part of this picture, because the passions, the anger and the grief, and the anxious reaching after what is not yet present, and the dread of what might eventually arrive, are where the confusion actually lives. Not an abstract philosophical error, but in the felt texture of ordinary days. The argument he made was not that the passions were wrong to feel. It was that they were not primary. They were secondary responses to primary assessments, and the assessments were where the real work was. A fear is always a fear of something, and underneath the fear is always a claim about that something, a claim that its arrival would damage something genuinely good, something that is genuinely mine to protect. Chrysippus asked that the claim be examined, not urgently, not with the alarm of someone trying to argue themselves out of a feeling before it overwhelms them, but patiently, with the steady curiosity of someone who has enough philosophical background to know that the examination tends to go somewhere useful. What exactly is this fear claiming will be damaged? Is that thing genuinely mine? Is it genuinely good? Or is it preferred, which is different? If it is preferred, if what I fear losing is reputation or health, or the regard of someone whose opinion I have mistaken for a verdict on my worth, then the fear has found its source, and the source once found tends to be smaller than the fear. This did not make the Stoic life an emotionally impoverished one. The tradition was sometimes read this way, in antiquity and afterward, and the reading was always a misreading. Seneca's letters are full of warmth, real affection for his correspondence, genuine grief at loss, the specific textures of friendship, and intellectual pleasure, and the ordinary satisfactions of a careful day well lived. Marcus Aurelius, for all the austerity of his self-corrections, writes with an obvious and deep love for philosophy, for the philosophical community he belonged to across centuries, for his teachers, for what a human being is capable of when it is trying. Epictetus taught with an intensity that his students remembered for the rest of their lives, not because he was drilling them in doctrines, but because he was showing them, by his own example, what the philosophical understanding of value actually looked like when it was genuinely held. The emotions available to someone practicing Stoic ethics were not thin, they were clarified. They were the emotions of someone who knew what they were actually feeling about, who had done enough philosophical work to distinguish the real grief from the story. The grief was telling, the real pleasure from the grasping that sometimes attached itself to pleasure and turned it into something heavier. The Stoic sage, that nearly impossible ideal, was not emotionless. The tradition distinguished between the passions, which rested on false judgments about value, and what they called eupatheia, good emotional states, the emotions appropriate to someone whose judgments were clear. These included joy rather than pleasure, caution rather than fear, wishing well rather than desire. The distinctions are subtle, but they pointed at something real: the difference between an emotion that flows cleanly from a clear assessment of the world and an emotion that is tangled up with a false claim about what matters. The false claims were not moral failures, they were philosophical errors, and philosophical errors, unlike moral failures in some traditions, were correctable not easily, not quickly, not without returning to the correction again and again across years of practice, but in principle, and often enough in practice, correctable. And this was the most quietly hopeful thing about the Stoic account of emotional life. It was not a system of rules to follow, it was an understanding to develop. And the development of that understanding was itself the change, not the prize at the end of the work, but the texture of the work itself, felt from the inside, gradually and without drama, as the clarity accumulated. There was a school, and there were teachers, and there were arguments built across centuries by people who disagreed about the details while sharing the central orientation. But all of that institutional and intellectual structure was always, in the end, in service of something that happened in a single person, alone with their judgments. The architecture Chrysippus built was not for admiration, it was for use. The four virtues were not a description of what a virtuous person looked like from outside. They were a description of the direction the interior life moved when it was moving in the right direction. Wisdom and courage and justice and temperance as four aspects of a single motion, available to anyone who could choose to move. A student reading the Enchiridion for the first time, sitting in a cold room, with Epictetus's clean declarative sentences in front of them, might feel the philosophy as a kind of relief. Not the relief of a problem solved. The problems are still exactly where they were, but the relief of a problem correctly identified. The source of disturbance is here, in this judgment, in this false claim about what is genuinely mine to lose. Not out there, in the senator's behavior or the outcome of the campaign or the regard of the person who gave no regard. Here, which means the work is possible, which means the direction is clear, even if the distance is long and the progress is slow and the sage is by most honest reckonings still a long way off. The argument does not resolve into silence, it keeps asking to be worked. But working it, Chrysippus found, and Seneca found, and Marcus found riding alone in the lamplight, with his military tent around him and the Danube outside, and the long work of an empire pressing at every edge. Working it was the life, not a preparation for the life, not the theory behind the life, the actual texture of it, felt from the inside, in the small, patient daily effort of keeping the judgments clear. The passions are judgments, the virtues are unified, the sage is nearly impossible and completely necessary as a direction. The preferred indifferents are real enough to pursue and light enough to release. And underneath all of it, the single foundational claim that holds the architecture together: virtue alone is genuinely good, and virtue is the rational soul's own nature, fully expressed, and that nature cannot be taken by any circumstance that exists or any event that could arrive. The fear that woke at 3 a.m. claiming otherwise was always, somewhere beneath its urgency, a claim about value that the tradition had already answered, patiently and in detail, and would answer again as many times as the question needed to be brought back to it. The work was not completed, it was returned to, again and again, with the steady, unhurried patience that Chrysippus had brought to building the architecture, and Marcus had brought to checking himself against it, and Seneca had brought to writing his way toward what he understood and what he still did not. The understanding not final, not closed, but moving, always, in the direction the compass held, and in that moving, something that was not peace exactly, but was quieter than disturbance, and steadier than confusion, and available, always, to the person willing to examine what they were actually claiming when they said they were afraid. Seneca would not go to sleep before he had spoken with himself. That is how he described it, not as a ritual, not as a discipline he had forced himself into, but as a conversation he was unwilling to skip. Before the lamp was put out, before the silence of the house settled into something complete, he would sit with the day and ask it to account for itself. Where did anger appear and go unexamined? Where did an opportunity for patience present itself and get refused? What could have been handled with more care, more honesty, more of the quiet steadiness he had spent decades trying to cultivate? The questions were not meant to wound. They were meant to clear. He attributed the practice to his teacher Sextius, a philosopher he admired with something close to devotion, and the form it took in Seneca's own telling is spare and precise. 3 questions. What fault did I correct today? What vice did I resist? In what respect am I better than I was? Not a catalogue of failures laid out for punishment, but a reckoning, the kind a person undertakes, not because they expect to find everything in order, but because leaving things unexamined is a different kind of harm, quieter and more cumulative. Seneca called his soul before himself each evening as before a judge. The judge was not harsh, but the judge was honest, and the honesty was the point. There is something in the image that asks to be held for a moment. The lamp still lit, the house around it already given over to the dark. One person sitting with the sediment of a day and running it slowly through attentive hands, not performing self-improvement, not writing for an audience, only accounting the way a careful person accounts for what passed through their hands during a day of work, not because they are anxious about the numbers, but because attention, sustained and returned to, is itself what keeps things right. Seneca was not the only one who brought this quality of patient self-examination to the threshold of sleep. In a military tent on the banks of the Danube, far from the city he ruled and the household he had left behind, Marcus Aurelius opened his notebook with the same purpose and a different method. Where Seneca ran questions through the day, Marcus ran language. He wrote to himself in Greek, blunt and unornamented, the private tongue of a philosophical education that preceded the emperor and would outlast him. The notes were not polished. They were not arranged with the care of a man who anticipated readers, and they were the rough functional work of a mind, using writing the way a craftsman uses a whetstone, not to display the tool, but to keep its edge. What he wrote, again and again, across years and campaigns and seasons of grief, were corrections. He reminded himself that the senators, whose behavior had frustrated him, were not within his governance. He reminded himself that the plague moving through the city was not a punishment or an anomaly, but part of the same providential order that produced everything else he had ever been given. He reminded himself, with a patience that must sometimes have been costly, that nothing appearing before him as a crisis was genuinely new, that it had all appeared before in other forms and other names, and that those who faced it had passed and been forgotten, and that he too would pass, and that the forgetting was not terrible, but simply true. The notebook was never meant to be read. That is not a minor detail. It changes the character of what is written in it, the way a letter changes character when you learn the writer never intended to send it. Marcus was not constructing a position for an audience. He was not shaping himself for posterity. He was writing because the act of writing steadied the mind, because the discipline of putting a thought into words required a precision that merely thinking the thought could avoid, and because the practice of returning to the same corrections over many years was the practice itself, not a preparation for something else, but the actual philosophical work done in private, in the dark, for no one but the person who needed it. The Stoics understood, in a way that feels very close even across the distance of 20 centuries, that philosophical work is largely done at night, not in the sense of scholarship or argument, but in the sense of the interior reckoning that daylight tends to postpone. During the day, there are tasks and obligations and the friction of other people, and the mind manages these things with varying degrees of equanimity and makes its compromises and moves on. It is at the edges of the day, in the particular stillness that gathers when the demands have mostly quieted, that the judgments made during those hours become available for examination. Seneca knew this. Marcus knew it. The evening review was not an addition to Stoic practice. It was its natural home. The practice Seneca called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, belongs to this same quiet territory. Not evening exactly, not a fixed hour, but the unhurried interior space in which something ordinarily avoided becomes deliberately approached. What would it mean to lose what is most relied upon? The steady income, the good health, the person whose presence structures the texture of each day, not as catastrophizing, not as a spiral into fear, but as the deliberate, brief holding of an absence where something familiar had been. Seneca practiced this with care. He wrote that poverty, freely contemplated, loses most of its terror. He wrote that the person who has rehearsed misfortune in the mind is not crushed by it when it arrives, not because they have become cold to what they have lost, but because they have already, in some quiet interior way, practiced being without it and found that they were still there. The mechanism is not complicated, but it is easy to misread. The premeditation of evils is not pessimism wearing a philosophical costume. It is closer to the opposite, a practice whose aim is gratitude, so specific and so alert that ordinary possession becomes briefly luminous. A person imagines, for a moment, the absence of something taken for granted, the quality of the light in a particular room at a particular hour, the warmth of a blanket that has become so familiar it is no longer noticed, and the imagined absence makes the present version of it briefly visible again, the way an eye adjusts when a lamp is lifted and then returned. What was simply there becomes for a moment genuinely present. And genuine presence is what the anxious accumulation of goods was always trying to purchase and never could. Seneca had a keen sense of how much time gets spent in this kind of accumulation and how little it purchases. He wrote to his friend Lucilius with an intimacy and an urgency that no amount of philosophical framing quite domesticates. Letters that feel still like something sent between two people who are genuinely trying to help each other think straight before it is too late. He was old when he wrote most of them. He knew, with the kind of knowledge that sits in the body rather than only in the mind, that time was not an indefinite resource. And the thing he returned to most, across the many subjects the letters cover, was the distinction between time spent and time lived, between the hours that pass in distraction, in deferred intensity, in the management of things that turn out not to have mattered, and the hours in which something genuine is actually happening. To practice voluntary privation, to sleep one night on the floor, to wear rough clothing for a day, to eat simply when one might eat well, was for Seneca a way of bringing this distinction into physical contact. Not asceticism as an end in itself, not the performance of austerity before an audience of one's own moral vanity, but an experiment, practical and specific, designed to demonstrate that the conditions feared most are survivable, and in surviving them less terrible than the imagination had constructed them to be. The fear of poverty was often worse than poverty. The dread of discomfort was often more uncomfortable than the discomfort itself, and a single night spent on the floor, deliberately chosen, could dissolve months of anxious avoidance. What Seneca was after in all of this was the education of expectation, the slow recalibration of what the mind presents as necessary and what it presents as merely preferred. The Stoics had a category for this: preferred indifference. Things worth pursuing through appropriate means, worth arranging for and taking reasonable care of, but not worth defending at the cost of character, not worth confusing with what is genuinely good. Health is a preferred indifferent. So is financial security. So is the good opinion of those around you. None of these are nothing. They matter in the moderate way that things not genuinely good can still matter. But the mind that has been trained by premeditatio malorum, by voluntary privation, by the nightly review, that mind holds them at the right distance. It moves toward preferred things without grasping. It loses preferred things without devastation. And in that interval between grasping and devastation, which is most of a life, it is largely at rest. Musonius Rufus, who taught Epictetus, and whose lectures were recorded by others in the way that early Stoic teachings often were, understood philosophy as a practice that had to appear in the body before it appeared anywhere else, in the way a person sat down to eat, in the manner of their rising in the morning, in the quality of attention brought to small things that the philosophically unserious tend to delegate to habit. He was not interested in students who could argue well about virtue, but whose daily life gave no evidence of having understood it. For Musonius, the philosopher was someone whose philosophy had migrated from the page into the hands, into the posture, into the texture of each hour, not as performance and not as strain, but as something more like a slow accommodation, the way a body gradually adjusts to a new weight until carrying it becomes natural. There is a quality in this teaching that functions even at a distance as a kind of permission, not the permission to stop trying, but the permission to understand that trying, when it proceeds with genuine patience and genuine seriousness, is what the philosophy actually looks like. The philosopher is not the person who has arrived at permanent equanimity and now lives above the disturbances that unsettle others. The philosopher is the person who returns each evening to the same practice of careful self-examination and each morning rises to try again. The imperfection is not a deficiency in the method. The returning is the method. Marcus Aurelius understood this with particular clarity because he had to. He was not a hermit philosopher practicing equanimity in a quiet room. He was an emperor governing an empire during plague, during war, during the slow administrative friction of governing millions of people with inadequate information and imperfect advisors, and a body that was aging, and a mind that sometimes wished for a very different life. The meditations are full of evidence that he was not always calm. They are full of impatience redirected, of frustration noted, and then deliberately set aside, of the repeated instruction to himself to remember what he knew, to act from the part of himself he had spent decades cultivating, rather than from the part that was tired, or irritated, or simply very human. What makes the notebook remarkable is not the philosophy in it. Much of what Marcus writes is a restatement of Stoic ideas that would have been familiar to any educated person of his era. What makes it remarkable is the evidence of the work, the same correction appearing 6 years later in slightly different words. The same reminder about the senators addressed to himself again, with slightly more weariness and slightly more patience. The philosophy is not a solution Marcus arrived at and then possessed. It is something he had to keep choosing in the specific circumstances of each day, against the specific resistances each day brought. And the notebook is the trace of that choosing, not the monument to a finished achievement, but the working record of a practice that was never finished. In one of the passages that has the quality of arriving from a very long distance and landing close, Marcus writes about the view from above. He does not call it that, but the practice is there, a deliberate imaginative ascent to a height from which the affairs of Rome, the politics of the court, the arguments and ambitions and small urgencies of the day resolve first into pattern and then into something very like silence. From that height, the city looks different. The person who insulted him this morning is very small. The administrative problem that seemed so pressing at midday has lost its ability to press, and the emperor himself, observing all of this from his imagined altitude, is also small, a fact which he appears to have found, reliably, not humiliating but relieving. The view from above is an old technique in the Stoic tradition. Seneca arrived at something similar through historical reflection rather than spatial imagination, by considering the long procession of the dead, the civilizations that felt permanent and are now archaeological, the philosophers whose names were once household words and are now known only to specialists. The effect aimed at is the same. Present anxieties held against the scale of centuries reveal themselves as scaled to the moment and not to the cosmos. They are real, they are not trivial, but they are not as large as they feel from inside them, and the knowledge of this, not as a comforting platitude, but as a philosophical position, actually inhabited, is one of the genuine gifts the Stoic tradition has to offer. A person lying awake in the small hours of a night that seems to have misplaced its end has probably already tried the arithmetic of reassurance. The problem is not as bad as feared. Tomorrow will bring more information. Others have faced worse. These thoughts are not wrong, but they tend to operate on the surface of the anxiety rather than beneath it, because they are arguing with the content of what is worrying rather than with the underlying judgment about what the content means. The Stoic move is different. It is not to argue that the thing is smaller than it seems, but to notice the mechanism that is making it seem large. The judgment, automatic and largely unconscious, that what is under threat belongs to the category of genuinely good things, things whose loss would constitute genuine harm to something essential. The distinction is the same one Epictetus carried with him out of a Roman slave household and through decades of teaching in a small school in Nicopolis. What is genuinely mine is very small. Opinions, impulses, the faculty of rational choice itself. These are mine in a way that nothing external is mine, because nothing external can be taken from me in the sense in which the faculty of judgment can be taken, which is to say, only by my own surrender of it. Health can go, reputation can go, the people held most dear can go. The Stoics were not sentimental about this. They did not pretend that these losses were easy or that grief was irrational. What they argued was that beneath the grief there is still something that cannot be touched, still operating, still capable of choosing how to meet what has happened, and that this faculty, brought seriously into contact with its own nature, tends to recognize, in that recognition, a kind of ground. What the nights of self-examination are for, finally, is the maintenance of that ground, not the building of it. The ground is already there in the capacity for rational judgment that no circumstance can remove. But the cultivation of the awareness of it, the practice of returning to it as reliably as Seneca returned to his three questions and Marcus returned to his notebook, because the mind, left to its own habits, tends to locate itself in what it most recently experienced, rather than in what is most fundamentally true. And what it most recently experienced was the day, with its small provocations and its larger disappointments, and its routine distribution of moments spent in something less than full presence. The evening review is a reorientation. It returns the mind from what it has been absorbed in to what it actually is, and in that return, the day loses some of its residue. What cannot be corrected is noted and set down. What can be approached differently tomorrow is also noted and set down. And what was genuinely handled well, because some things are, is allowed to rest in the acknowledgement of it. Seneca writes, in one of the letters to Lucilius, that time is the one thing of which we should be most jealous, because it is the one thing that once spent cannot be recovered in any form. He returns to this with what seems like genuine urgency, not the urgency of anxiety, but the urgency of someone who has looked clearly at the arithmetic and found it instructive. The days are going. They are going, whether or not they are being lived with care. And the Stoic evening practice is in this sense an act of reclamation, not of the day that is past, but of the attention that the day may have scattered. Each evening that ends in this kind of deliberate self-examination is an evening whose hours have been, in some partial but genuine sense, gathered back, not all of them, but enough. The premeditation of evils and the evening review, and the practice of voluntary privation, and the view from above, these are not four separate exercises assembled into a curriculum. They are the same orientation, finding expression in different circumstances. They all begin from the same recognition that most suffering is produced not by circumstances, but by the judgments layered over circumstances, and that these judgments, because they are the mind's own work, are within the mind's power to examine, and with patient effort over time, to revise. The Stoics were not naive about how long this takes. Chrysippus wrote about the passions not as forces to be overcome, but as mistaken judgments to be understood, which implies something about how deeply mistaken judgments can be embedded before they become visible, and how long genuine understanding can take to reach the places where the errors actually live. This is why the practice is nightly. Not because one session of philosophical self-examination produces lasting equanimity, but because the equanimity, if it comes at all, is the accumulated residue of very many sessions. The way a stone wears not from any single moment of water, but from the long patience of the water's returning. The philosopher is the water, the returning is the practice, and the stone, whatever in the mind, remains hard and resistant and prone to the same mistaken judgments, despite years of examination, yields gradually, not all at once, and the yielding is the philosophical life. Marcus Aurelius was not more rational than other people. He was not less susceptible to anger or impatience or the specifically imperial varieties of frustration that come from governing an empire that frequently fails to conform to one's governance. What the meditations show is a person who, having encountered Stoic philosophy in his education and found in it something that seemed true and worth living by, spent decades returning to its principles in the specific context of his specific life, with its specific pressures and its specific failures of application. He lost his temper. He doubted. He wrote to himself more than once that the practice was worthwhile in a tone that suggests the conviction was not always effortless. What he built over those decades was not a monument to perfect Stoic equanimity. It was a record of honest effort. And the record, available now across 20 centuries to anyone lying in the dark who is also trying to hold the day at a useful distance, has the particular warmth of something that was never meant to console anyone, but somehow does. The view from above has this warmth too, in its own colder register. Marcus describes looking down at the Danube, and at the tent, and at the dispatch that came in this afternoon and will need to be answered tomorrow, and at the whole complex apparatus of the empire and its needs, and finding in the ascent not a solution to any of it, but a perspective in which all of it becomes briefly proportionate. The problems do not disappear. The dispatches will still be there in the morning, but their claim on the quality of the present moment, the specific, irreplaceable quality of this particular moment of being alive and conscious and capable of choice, is reduced to something the mind can hold without being overwhelmed by it. Seneca achieved this through a different path, but arrived somewhere adjacent. In the letters he wrote near the end of his life, he returned often to the image of lives compressed into a few pages of history or forgotten entirely, great figures whose names are now lost, great empires whose edges can no longer be traced. He did not find this depressing. He found it clarifying, because what it suggested was that the urgency attached to most of what occupied his contemporaries was borrowed from a scale that did not belong to it, the scale of permanent significance attached to things that were always already temporary. And the person who understood this, who had genuinely absorbed it rather than merely nodding at it, was freed from a kind of expenditure that most people make without knowing they are making it, the expenditure of treating temporary things as though they were permanent, the exhaustion of defending what was never really possessable, the grief larger than it needed to be of losing what was always going to be lost. There is a very specific kind of rest available in this understanding, not the rest of resignation, which carries its own quiet bitterness, not the rest of indifference, which has given something genuine up, but the rest of proportion, the easing that comes when the mind stops carrying things at the wrong scale, when the fear that has been occupying the front of the mind for weeks is returned to its actual size, which is usually smaller than fear makes things feel, and when the thing that is genuinely good, the capacity to respond, to choose, to maintain the quality of one's own character in the face of whatever the day brings, is given back the prominence it is owed. The evening review is where this proportion is restored. 3 questions, or something like them, not asked with severity, not asked with the expectation of finding the day perfect, because the day will not be perfect, and the practice rests not on perfection, but on honest looking. What fault did I correct? What vice did I resist? In what respect is the self slightly more itself than it was this morning? The questions are modest and patient. They ask only for honesty, and honesty because it requires no particular talent and submits to no particular disadvantage is always available. The lamp is low. The house has given itself over to the dark in the way houses do when the last person awake is finally still. The day's accumulation, its arguments and its silences, its moments of real presence and its longer stretches of half attention, its 1 or 2 instances of genuine generosity and its rather larger number of instances of something less, has been held, briefly and honestly, in the light of these questions. Some of it will be carried forward as a small intention to return the next time. Something of this kind arises with slightly more patience, slightly more of the philosophical steadiness that the practice, over time, is slowly depositing. Some of it can simply be set down, released from the obligation of continued carrying, left where the day left it. From a very great height, higher than the lamp, higher than the city of which this room is one quiet corner, the entire arrangement of this evening is very small. One person in one room on one night that will be followed by another and another until they stop. The sequence of nights does not constitute a crisis, it constitutes a life.